Well, Bob Hauser likes to send emails around. You know, he's become my regular source here lately. And he sent one around that made me laugh last week. And it was why men friends are better than women friends. I don't know if some of you may have seen this already. And I liked it because it made a point. And it's sort of, it's couched in an illustration, and I put it in the context of a couple. And so there's this couple, and the woman goes out for the evening. And later in the evening, she calls and says to her husband, "I'm going to stay overnight with one of my friends." And so that's fine. So the next morning, they get up, or he gets up, and she's not there, and some time goes by, and finally he starts calling her 10 best friends. And none of them have seen her or heard from her. Well, the next night, he goes out. And later in the evening, he calls and said, "I'm going to stay overnight with one of my friends." Well, the next morning, she gets up, and he's not there, and so she gets concerned, and so she calls 10 of his best friends, and 8 of them said they stayed with him, and 2 of them said that he was still there. You have to think a little bit about it, but... So what's the definition of a good friend? One that's willing to give you what you need, right? Perhaps, I don't know. But today, you know, we're talking about giving. And we're in that sort of journey of this whole power of giving from the book, The Power of Giving, which is a very sweet book. We have some in the bookstore. It's written by Azim, Jamal, and Harvey McKinnon. And they're from Vancouver, British Columbia. And they really have sort of created sort of a consciousness about how to kind of bring the essence and the experience of giving into our life. And the second chapter really focuses on the idea of what it is that we can give. You know, what are the things or experiences that show up? Sometimes we wonder, you know, what can I give? You know, and so they talk about those, and they have a kind of a laundry list of those things. But what it comes down to at the end, and really what my focus is today, and what I think is one of the most important things that we can be aware of, and one of the most simple things that will help us in that, is that we can give what it is that we need most. What it is that you can give is what you need most. Now, when you think about giving what you need most, in some ways it's a little bit paradoxical in the sense that how can I give what I need most when that's what I don't have? In other words, how can I give what I don't have if I'm going to give what I need? So what I need is usually what I don't have, and we come up with what it is that we need in the context of what we lack. Isn't it true that we think in terms of lack when we think in terms of what we don't have? And it's not hard for us at all to think in terms of what we need. I mean, I can think right now of things that I would like to have, or desires that I would like to have show up in my life, or experiences, or whatever it is. And so if we think in terms of those experiences, because often that's what we spend our time focusing on, then can we not think that, okay, what do I need to give? How can I show up in my experience in that way? I have a friend of mine who is a ministerial classmate. Her name is Margaret. And we graduated and were ordained together. And she was, in her former life, she was a Catholic nun. And now she never actually went through the whole process, but she almost was there, and finally she decided that that wasn't her path, and she left the convent, I guess, whatever it is, and she got married, and she had a child, and then she was in ministerial school, and she'd gotten divorced, which tells you why she probably ended up in Unity, because it doesn't work really well in the Catholic experience, at least especially back then. And so she ended up in Unity, and she was in ministerial school, and she was a single mom. And of course, it's not easy being a single mom and supporting your child and going to school full time and all that. And so she had this sort of equanimity about her. You know, she carried herself with grace. She's a beautiful woman. And she is very loving and very peaceful, and she just has this sort of air about her. And we graduated, and she took the church in Laguna Hills, California. And that was 25 years ago, and she's still the minister of that church. So she settled in there. And early on in her ministerial, when she took that church, it was a small group, and it began to grow, and she worked with it, and she was successful. And of course, when you get together, especially back then, we get together a year, 2, 3 years after we graduated, you talk about what works and what doesn't work and how you're showing up and all that stuff. And she had this sort of prosperity thing. She always seemed to have enough. And I asked her, I said, well, how does that show up in your life? And she said, well, I'm a tither. She said, but tithing wasn't quite enough for me. I thought about it and thought about how it shows up, and I really, being a single mom, I really needed more income than what I was getting in my church. And so I decided that instead of just tithing 10% of what I received, that I was going to tithe 10% of what I wanted, or what I needed, or what I desired. And so she at the beginning of the year, she'd sit down, she'd say, okay, if she was making $3,000 a month, for example, back then, and she needed to make $4,000 in order to be where she wanted to be, then instead of tithing $300 a month, she would tithe $400 a month. Now, that's not an easy thing to do for a single mom who's taking care of things and so on and so forth, but invariably, by the end of the year, her income would be at that level. When she, maybe not for the whole year, but she would reach that level. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's something that you should do. What I'm sharing with you is that often when we look at ways in which we can give what it is that we need, sometimes kind of showing up in unique ways can be very powerful and very creative. And it has been for her, and she has been very successful throughout her career. She remarried, and she lives a wonderful life. And whenever I see her, she has this equanimity about her, this sort of peace and this confidence about life, and that's the way in which she shows up. The question is, what do you need and desire in your life? What would you like to have? We all have our needs and desires all the time. Even if we are living an abundant life, there are still things that we would like to have show up in our life experience. So what do you need and desire? And usually the areas that show up in people's lives are love, finances, health, friendship, joy, companionship, security, stability, attention, getting attention, knowledge. There's lots of areas in terms of our experience that we would like to enhance, and I like to think of it that way, to enhance in our life experience, whatever it is that we feel is successful. Now, so we define our desires in terms of what is missing. And it occurred to me, how life is such a huge circle. It seems like everything comes back around. If we live long enough, I think we have to face just about everything that comes back around. And of course, I've talked about the fact that my daughter Caroline is now at the University of Idaho,